So, have you ever wondered if the choices you make are really yours? Or if, something else is pulling the strings?
Yeah.
It's a strange feeling, isn't it? Like maybe you're sitting in a quiet cafe, watching the world go by, and suddenly you're just not so sure if you're the one deciding what happens next, or if you're just part of the scenery.
That quiet cafe feeling, it really captures the heart of this whole thing. For centuries, philosophers have been circling this exact question, free will.
Do we really have it?
Yeah, do we? This power to choose our own path.
Yeah.
Or is that feeling of control just, a story our minds tell us? There's a whole spectrum of thinking on this.
Right.
From, absolute autonomy at one end
Complete free will.
to the other end, suggesting everything is predetermined. And, of course, lots of interesting positions in between.
Okay, let's try and unpack this, just like we're chatting here, No heavy academic stuff.
Definitely.
Our mission is just to explore this kind of thorny topic like we're those two friends catching up over coffee.
Exactly.
Sure.
So let's start with something we all feel, right? The actual feeling of making a choice.
Yeah, day in, day out.
We feel like we're deciding things, what to do, what to say, even what to think. It's this constant sense of agency.
That feeling, I'm the one in charge here, it's so deeply ingrained, isn't it? But if you actually pause and really look at it, where does that feeling even come from?
Right.
Could it be that this sensation of freedom is just, a really convincing trick our minds play? Like those moments you think you see something flicker in your peripheral vision?
But it wasn't really there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's precisely what some people argue. They suggest that if we really pay attention moment to moment, this feeling of free will can be surprisingly elusive. It's not always there, steady and constant.
It flickers.
It flickers, yeah. And when you try to pin it down, it can almost seem to disappear. So the argument isn't just that free will might not exist, but that even our feeling of having it might be less solid than we assume.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Brings us to the big clash. Determinism versus free will.
The classic showdown.
Now, determinism, basically, it says that everything that happens, every single choice we make, is the inevitable result of what came before. Is that about right?
Yeah, pretty much. Like one giant chain reaction stretching all the way back.
To the beginning of time.
Essentially. Determinism suggests only one future is truly possible. Given all the conditions leading up to any moment, there's only one way things could have gone.
And that clashes directly with the libertarian view of free will.
Right. Which holds that we genuinely had the ability to make choices that aren't determined by the past.
We could have chosen differently.
Exactly, even if everything leading up to that decision point was identical.
So if you think those two ideas just cannot coexist, that's incompatibilism.
That's the term, yes, incompatibilism. And within that camp, there are different viewpoints.
Okay, like what?
Well, you've got hard determinists. They say, look, determinism is true, so free will, it's impossible, just an illusion.
Simple enough.
Then you have metaphysical libertarians. They argue the opposite. Determinism is false, which makes free will possible.
Okay.
And then there's maybe a more subtle position, hard incompatibilism.
Hard incompatibilism. What's that?
They suggest that neither determinism nor indeterminism is compatible with genuine free will.
Wait, hang on. Even if things aren't determined, we still might not have free will. How does that logic work?
Well, the argument often goes like this. For an action to be truly free, we need to be the ultimate source, the originator, sometimes called causa sui, a self-caused cause.
Right.
But if our actions aren't determined, they might just be random, the result of pure chance, maybe quantum fluctuations or something. And randomness doesn't feel like free will either, does it?
No, that doesn't sound like me being in control. It sounds like chaos, like my arm just jerking randomly versus me choosing to raise it.
Precisely. It's the difference between choosing to speak and your vocal cords just, randomly twitching. So randomness doesn't seem to equal freedom either.
Okay, that makes a weird kind of sense. So that's the incompatibilist side. What about the other side?
That's compatibilism. These thinkers believe that free will and determinism can actually coexist. They're compatible.
That sounds a bit like trying to square the circle. How do they manage that?
Well, compatibilists often start by redefining what we mean by free will. They might say, look, as long as our actions are voluntary, meaning we're not, physically forced or coerced, they can be considered free, even if they're ultimately caused by prior events in that deterministic chain.
So freedom is more about acting according to your own desires and values without external constraint, even if those desires were themselves determined.
That's a common way to frame it, yeah. And some compatibilists go even further. They argue that determinism isn't just compatible with free will, it might actually be necessary for it.
Necessary? How could it be necessary?
The reasoning is that making meaningful choices requires us to understand cause and effect. We need to know how our actions will likely turn out right.
Sure, otherwise you're just acting blindly.
Exactly. If the world wasn't predictable to some extent, if it wasn't deterministic in how things generally unfold, our choices would feel arbitrary, pointless. We wouldn't know what we were choosing for.
Okay, I see the logic there. So for compatibilists, the whole determinism versus free will framing is maybe the wrong way to look at it.
They often say it's a false dilemma, yeah.
Yeah.
A misunderstanding of what freedom really means in a practical sense.
Let's go back to that ultimate cause idea for a second. The incompatibilists, they really hang their hat on this causal chain argument, don't they?
They absolutely do. They argue that if you trace back the causes of any action, anything you do,
Like deciding what coffee to order.
anything, trace it back. Eventually, you'll hit factors you didn't choose. Your genes, your upbringing, your environment, maybe even random events that shaped you.
Stuff outside my control.
Exactly. These things shape who you are. They influence your desires, your character, the options you even consider. So if every cause has a prior cause that you didn't ultimately choose, how can you be the true originating source of your actions?
And the determinists, they just nod along with that. They say, yep, that's right. Everything you do is just the end of a long line of dominoes falling.
That's pretty much the deterministic viewpoint on that specific point. They agree that the causal chain extends beyond us. They'd argue this whole notion of being a completely self-created ultimate cause, totally independent of any prior influence, well, it's illogical from their perspective.
Everything has a cause.
Right. And that chain of causes goes way back, outside our individual control.
We've been talking a lot about determinism. It feels like maybe there are different flavors of it.
Oh, definitely. Causal determinism, the idea we mostly been discussing, that everything is caused by prior conditions according to fixed laws. That's the most common one in these debates.
Okay.
But then there's also logical determinism.
Logical.
Yeah, this is the idea that all statements or propositions about the future, like you will drink coffee tomorrow, are already either true or false right now, in the present.
Whoa, that's kind of mind-bending. So the future's already fixed, factually speaking. We just haven't experienced it yet.
That's the idea. It's like the future is already written down somewhere. We just haven't turned to that page.
Okay, what else?
Then you have theological determinism. This ties it to a divine being.
Like God's plan.
Either God's plan ordaining everything or simply God's foreknowledge. If an all-knowing deity already knows with certainty everything you are going to do,
Then are your choices truly free? Or are you just acting out a pre-known script?
exactly. That's the dilemma theological determinism poses.
So across all these different kinds of determinism, there's this common thread that our gut feeling of making free choices might be, well, misleading somehow.
That's the core challenge they pose to libertarian free will, yes. They suggest that when we really examine our thoughts, our intentions, the whole process, even the feeling of freely choosing can seem less concrete, less definite.
You mentioned earlier that the feeling itself might be fleeting. I saw someone online joke, the fact that free will is an illusion is also an illusion. What do you think they might have meant by that?
That's a clever twist. I think the point could be, if you really focus intently on your moment-to-moment experience, you don't necessarily feel like you're constantly, actively making free choices in some grand sense. Thoughts just pop up, impulses arise. You often act without this, like, slow, deliberate, conscious weighing of options preceding every single tiny action.
Yeah, a lot happens automatically.
Right. So the argument goes, maybe even the idea that we have a consistent illusion of free will is an oversimplification. Maybe the experience itself is more fragmented, less like a constant movie of me choosing and more like just stuff happening in consciousness.
That definitely makes you reconsider things. Like, okay, take anger. If we genuinely don't have libertarian free will, if people couldn't have done otherwise, does it even make sense to get angry when someone doesn't meet our expectations?
That's a really tough implication, isn't it? If people aren't the ultimate authors of their actions, why hold them morally responsible? In the point of feeling anger. Anger often comes from that feeling of, you should have done differently.
But, okay, couldn't you argue anger is just an evolved response? Something baked into us for survival, for social cohesion, regardless of the deep philosophy.
Absolutely. That's the counter-argument. Even if libertarian free will is off the table, anger can still function as, a motivator. It signals that a boundary's been crossed. It can push for social change. It's a response to perceived harm.
So it still has a purpose, even if its philosophical justification gets shaky.
Exactly. It highlights this tension between our maybe intellectual understanding of causality and our deeply ingrained emotional and social responses. Like someone pointed out online, it's very hard to argue we should feel nothing when someone does something truly awful, regardless of the ultimate causes.
Yeah, that's a hard sell emotionally. Okay, so this is making my head spin a bit. What about science? Does science offer any clearer answers? Like quantum physics, genetics, neuroscience? What do they add?
Well, quantum physics is interesting because it introduces genuine randomness or indeterminacy at the most fundamental level of reality.
Right. Things aren't perfectly predictable down there.
Exactly. So some people have wondered, could this randomness at the quantum level somehow bubble up and give space for free will at the level of our brains and choices?
So maybe our decisions aren't fully determined because there's always this tiny element of quantum chance shaking things up.
It's an idea.
Yeah.
But honestly, the link between quantum randomness and our complex thoughts and decisions is pretty speculative. It's not a widely accepted mechanism for free will.
Okay, so probably not quantum physics. And what about genetics and neuroscience?
Well, those fields clearly show that our biology has a massive influence on our behavior, no question. Our genes predispose us to certain traits, personalities, even vulnerabilities. And neuroscience shows undeniable links between brain activity, brain structure, and our thoughts, feelings, and actions. Damage to certain brain areas can drastically change personality and decision-making.
It's hard to argue with the biology. Does that just mean free will is, well, a biological illusion then, produced by the brain?
That's where the debate really heats up in science. Maybe the most famous or infamous findings come from neuroscience, specifically the experiments by Benjamin Libet back in the 80s.
Libet rings a bell. What did he find?
He measured brain activity while people made simple, spontaneous decisions, like flexing their wrist. He found that unconscious brain activity, this readiness potential, started building up before the person reported consciously deciding to move.
So the brain was getting ready to move before the person felt like they decided to move.
That's what it looked like, yeah.
Wow, okay, that sounds like a big blow to the idea of conscious free will initiating actions. It looks like the brain decides first, and then we become aware of it.
That was definitely one major interpretation. That our conscious will doesn't start the action. Maybe it just catches up, or perhaps even confabulates a story about having decided after the fact.
But are there counter-arguments? It sounds pretty definitive.
Oh yes, there are definitely counter-arguments. Some researchers argue that readiness potential might not be the specific decision signal itself, but more like general brain preparation, sort of like neural noise building up before a threshold is crossed.
Ah.
And crucially, even Libet himself thought we might still have a form of free will, specifically the power to veto the action. The conscious mind might not initiate, but maybe can still stop the process before the movement happens.
It's like a free won't.
Exactly, free won't. Plus, there are ongoing debates about the exact timing in those experiments, how accurately people can report their conscious intention, and what the readiness potential truly represents neurologically.
So even the science, it isn't settled. It adds data, but doesn't just give us the answer.
That's a very fair way to put it. It provides fascinating clues and constraints, but doesn't resolve the core philosophical questions. We're still largely interpreting what it all means.
Okay, so let's shift gears slightly. What do people actually believe about all this, intuitively? Do most people feel like things are determined, or do they feel free?
It's interesting. Some studies suggest people do have incompatibilist intuitions. If you present them with a purely deterministic scenario, it can weaken their belief in moral responsibility for actions within that scenario.
Makes sense. If it was all determined, how can you blame them?
But other studies find the opposite. Sometimes, even when people are told an action was determined, they still hold the person responsible, especially if the action was emotionally charged, like a crime.
Huh. So our intuitions might be kind of flexible, or maybe contradictory.
It seems like the context matters a lot. And the emotional weight of the situation, maybe our gut reaction about responsibility for, say, choosing vanilla over chocolate, is different than for a serious harmful act.
Yeah, that feels right.
But what is interesting is that belief in some form of free will seems pretty common across different cultures. It appears to be a fairly universal human intuition.
Which makes you wonder, why? If it's potentially an illusion, why is it such a sticky universal one? Maybe it serves some important purpose, psychologically or socially.
That's a great question, and it leads right into the practical side of things. Because, regardless of whether free will truly exists in some ultimate metaphysical sense,
Right.
the question of how we act based on the agency we believe we have is incredibly important. As someone online nicely put it, maybe the real question isn't just whether we have free will, but what we do with the will we think we have.
Oh, I like that. That really shifts the focus, doesn't it? Even if it turns out our choices aren't free in some absolute cosmic way, our experience of making choices, our belief in our ability to act, that shapes everything.
Yeah.
How we live, how we treat each other, how we think about responsibility, effort, change.
Precisely. So even if we don't get definitive philosophical or scientific answers, reflecting on our own sense of agency, our accountability, what we value, that remains absolutely vital.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into free will, wow, it's clear there are no easy answers, right?
Not at all. Complex stuff.
We've touched on that core feeling of choice, the big tension between determinism and freedom, these ideas about ultimate causes and causal chains.
Different kinds of determinism, the whole illusion idea.
Right, and what science adds or doesn't add, and what people tend to believe.
We've definitely explored a lot of different facets, hopefully without making everyone's head explode.
Hopefully. And, that brings us to our final reflection for you listening. Given how fundamental this experience of making choices feels to being human, what does that actually mean for how we live our lives? Regardless of the ultimate metaphysical truth, how does your own belief or maybe your uncertainty about free will shape the choices you actually make, the responsibilities you feel, the way you interact with the world?
It's definitely something worth pondering.
Yeah. Something to maybe think about next time you're sitting in that quiet cafe watching the world go by.